This is Peter Helland with David Wemhoff on the show Israel, and we're going to call this show Real Dynamics. And Dave has written the book that's kind of slowly hitting people more and more. And the name of the book is John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition. And the subtitle, Dave, can you read that subtitle? Because that's what I'm looking at.
Sure, how the CIA's doctrinal warfare program changed the Catholic Church.
Okay. What catches me is the doctrinal warfare, okay?
Why does that catch you?
Because Jesus said, Mark 8:15, and he charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." And the fishermen didn't quite go deep enough to figure out what he meant, okay? And they're going, "Has anybody got any bread? Don't we have our own bread? We're going to have to eat some of the Herod's bread." And Jesus heard them talking, and he goes, "You guys are really bad."
What did that mean?
He was talking about their doctrine.
Their doctrine.
Yeah, watch out for the doctrine of Herod.
The beliefs then, right?
Yeah, a government pushes doctrine, always. It believes in something. And the goal of the government is to always get in and co-opt the church, okay? Get their doctrine into the church's doctrine, or do something to make it more favorable to them. It's just the natural.
They want the support of the church, right?
They want their doctrine to get more play, okay? And they want to win their doctrine over the church's doctrine. So any infiltration into the church, and if you have a Catholic church, which is everywhere in the world, that's a lot of potential influence.
Jeez. That's like a big circulatory system.
Yeah.
If you get the Catholic Church, it's like a big circulatory system pumping all this doctrine around the world, because there's a Catholic church in every little town. There was a Catholic church right across the street from the Dwight D. Eisenhower archives in Abilene, Kansas, when I went there.
Mm-hmm. They're everywhere. So the issue is, okay, doctrine, teaching. Jesus said, watch out for the teaching of Herod. And Herod is more particular because your book is focusing not on another religious group influencing the Catholic. It's more on the CIA's doctrinal warfare. So CIA is a branch of government.
It is. Well, it works for the executive branch, right?
So it's more aligned with when Jesus said, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees, but he also said, and the leaven of Herod.
So there's definite scriptural ties here to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so the teaching of Herod was different than the doctrines of the Pharisees. So what Herod wants you to believe, or how he wants to deceive you, Jesus called him the sly fox, right?
He was called a sly fox, wasn't he?
Jesus called him, you are a sly fox. Because, in other words, you're trying to deceive us into some bad doctrine. Bad teaching, bad thinking, however you want to phrase it. So the CIA wanted to impose the doctrine of the American Proposition. I'm trying to put the dots together. Okay?
I think you're doing a great job.
Okay. So the American Proposition summarizes the doctrine that the CIA wants to infiltrate the Catholic Church with.
Yeah, I think they had a role to play in that. Yeah.
Okay. And that doctrine kind of originates, because I know we've talked about this, originates with a particular person stands out, which is Thomas Paine.
I've always thought Thomas Paine really crystallized the whole American ideology that underlay the formation of this society and also the government, I think.
Yeah. And John Adams said, without Paine, I don't know if this would have happened. Things like that.
Yeah. John Adams said Tom Paine was the most influential character from 1775 to 1805. That's pretty powerful. That was a very important time in human history.
Right. And Gordon S. Wood said a lot of the founders were disappointed in the outcome.
I don't know. I don't know if I can agree with that. I think that Gordon S. Wood also wrote that the founders were looking for some systematic way of determining what virtue was, people to the government.
When I'm saying that, I'm looking at the fact that Thomas Paine, I think it was 6 or 8, only 8 people even bothered to show up at his funeral. He was despised. Okay, so I'm just saying that to me is an indicator that there was some disappointment with what Paine was teaching, and upon that teaching they acted. And if they really agreed with his teaching, there would have been a lot more at his funeral.
Well, that's an interesting conclusion that you draw. He had a heck of a life. After he left America, he went over to France, and he did a lot of writing. He did the Rights of Man. He wrote that.
But they also put him up in the Bastille. They put him in prison.
He came pretty close to having his head cut off.
Right, because he disagreed with cutting off the head of the king.
Well, he avoided having his head cut off. The British didn't want him to return to England because of his doctrine.
Right, and the next books he wrote were to debunk Christianity.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
That's right.
And the history of Lincoln
That's
was that he also wrote a book. There was a guy named Dr. Hill, and Lincoln was a notorious doubter of Christianity, like Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, Lincoln supposedly, I've read books that say he absolutely did, wrote a 40-page pamphlet kind of imitating Paine's arguments, debunking the miracle claims or any kind of supernatural claim.
Well, Thomas Jefferson did that too.
Yes, right. But Jefferson was particularly the miracles, but Lincoln didn't agree with the divinity of Christ or the resurrection, any of that.
Right.
And that was not popular at the time of Thomas Paine's death because America had kind of come out of that unbelief part of the American Revolution. And so they were not agreeing with Paine's position on Christianity. 8 showed up for the funeral.
That's not a large number.
No, he turned them off. He turned the Americans off with his coming out of if you read Common Sense, you could see that he was going there, but it was cloaked.
Common Sense, he was trying to get people to get energized to fight the British, and he laid out the reasons why things were going to be different over here, how society would be put together.
And like we were talking, one of the main ideas was self-government.
Self-government. Well, it's an interesting concept because the colonies, as you know, were in a real struggle with the British between 1760 and about 1775. And I think John Adams actually said, the revolution was nothing, and the fight was over by 1775 because the revolution had already occurred.
The internal one.
The internal one had occurred, and people had made up their mind what they wanted, and they wanted to rule themselves. And, you look at the arguments back there. Bernard Bailyn, a constitutional scholar, wrote a book, which I think is very important, The Ideological Basis of the American Revolution. And he analyzed a number of different ideas that were going on in the American Revolution and before the American Revolution that led up to it. And one of these things was representing ourselves, self-government, representative government, having our own control of our own affairs. Because the English crown with the Parliament made a lot of decisions about the internal operations of the colonies. But there were a lot of reasons for that. But it still was not a very popular idea among the Americans. By 1775, and we'd pretty much made up our mind that was it.
Well, said this before, but John Wesley was corresponding with his brother Charles in 1735 in Boston, and Charles wrote back to John, said, they're talking independence here, which was another word for self-government. They were
1735.
1735. Boston was already making up their mind. We're going for it. Okay. And Wesley Charles couldn't believe it. He said, John, you can't believe what they're saying in the streets here. Okay, so this was fomenting. We're going for self-government, but that was an idea that the Puritans dealt with when John Cotton was confronted with the idea of democracy, and then John Cotton famously said, "Oh, so that's democracy then? But then, if the people are in charge, then who rules the people?" Well, nobody. Self-government. Oh, okay. It's an experiment in self-government. Okay, so if 37% of the people end up being obese, and only 3 or 4% of the people when they get married are virgins, and when the country may have a $30 trillion debt, and violence, I'm just going through the 7 deadly sins here, and violence is like going crazy, are you going to put up the white flag and say self-government isn't working? At what point are you going to admit the experiment in self-government is not working?
Well, how do you define self-government? I mean, are they able to, field an army and pass laws and handle disputes?
Well, the word self comes in, okay? When it says self-government, that does refer to a self. So how are the individuals actually, because I think on my YouTube point there, I say, John Adams said this Constitution, it only works for a religious and a moral people, okay? In other words, he's pointing to the idea of self-government, that if people don't govern themselves and they don't succeed at it, it's not going to work.
Well, you're talking about they govern their personal lives in accordance with a certain set of beliefs, a certain religion.
Well, the 10 Commandments, however you want to say it, if you don't govern yourself to a certain degree in conformity to God's law, I think they would even agree with that back then. If you don't maintain if the people don't maintain a certain success in governing themselves, and then the 7 deadly sins, gluttony, second one is fornication, third one is avarice, love of money, fourth is anger. If you can't get your anger under control, and your love of money under control, and your fornicating spirits under control, and your gluttony under control, the experiment's over. You guys failed.
Well, how do you figure that? Because, you still elect a legislature. You still elect a president.
Yeah, but
you still appoint the government officials of the Supreme Court.
When you're full of...
You still resolve disputes. You have clear rules, and
if you're blinded by the 7 deadly sins, your ability to choose is going to be so bad that you're going to choose evil instead of good because you're evil.
Well, that's a pretty strong statement. I
think it's biblical to the hilt.
But, there's a certain amount of truth here that, the United States is still going on stronger than ever. And you're saying that, if people can't govern themselves well, then that political entity comes to an end. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying this notion of self-government they would have admitted it's an experiment. Even Breyer, that just is resigning from the Supreme Court, talked about this as an experiment. His last word.
Justice Breyer, right.
Justice Breyer. Right. Breyer, sorry. And so, in other words, a fellow that's old and retiring off the Supreme Court, he closes his life by still calling this an experiment.
Well, and he also said, to his credit, he doesn't want to die on the court. So, that was insightful, and that would tend to support what you're saying. I think you're dealing, just recently, today is February 16th, so what was it, Monday, February 14th? Justice Amy Coney Barrett came to Notre Dame, and she gave a talk. And it's a very good talk. I found it very interesting. I did not watch all the questions.
But you didn't go to it?
I didn't go to it. It's on YouTube.
Okay.
And I recommend people watch it because I think it's a very good talk. She's obviously a very smart woman. She's obviously very well spoken. And she brought up this interesting point of, law and equity, justice and fairness. And she talked about Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which says that the Supreme Court and the courts of the United States have got all powers in law and equity. And she said, equity doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want to do. And it doesn't mean you do what your conscience tells you to do. And so that, I think, is something that sort of bears on what you and I have talked about over the years, which is, what are we supposed to bring to the table when we do things? When we make decisions, when we work, when we live our lives, what is it that we bring? It's that self-governance of morality, right? So right away you see, well, maybe there's, some tension here between, the American system and, say, religious systems. In Dignitatis Humanae, it says you're supposed to bring everything you do, to your whole life. To your whole life, your Catholic faith, everything you do. So that's what they tell you to do. So then the question is, what is the basis then of the law and of the equity in the American system? You have an answer for that?
I think of it like you always bring up Texas versus Lawrence, where they've even got to, that was what, 2002? I don't know when that was.
2003. Yeah.
2003, where if I understand your explanation of it is that Supreme Court decision infers that religion cannot really be the basis of where we bring forth a law. You can't say, well, the Ten Commandments says you can't commit adultery, so therefore we should have a law that says you can't commit adultery. In fact, if you tried to do that, that decision would say that's not legitimate or something.
I think we used to have laws like that, didn't we?
Yeah, but with Texas versus Lawrence, the divine positive law now is really pushed further away. And so now law has to be based, what, on scientific research? Hey, we have the scientific research, and based on this, we should pass this law. Wasn't that a shift? So like you just asked, if I understand your question, what is law based on?
How do you define law? That's a question. And what?
Well, I think it used to be defined, I don't think this question was that hard even before the Civil War. The law originates out of the Ten Commandments, if you want to get precise.
Law is defined as the will of God. That's how it's defined in Catholicism. It's defined as the will of God.
Even the law, let's say, comes from England. I don't think they would argue too much against that we inherited.
I don't think so. A lot of it grew up in tradition. A lot of the English law, the common law, grew up as part of tradition, as you know. Just what the British did, and they brought it over here, and then the Americans practiced it. But the idea of law has a very unique meaning, and it's been defined by the Catholic religion as meaning the will of God. It's also the idea of freedom has been defined as not licensed, doing whatever you want to do, but following the will of God. So you have the freedom to follow the will of God.
But CIA's doctrinal warfare and Jesus saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of Herod. Now we know that when you bake bread, there's various definitions of leaven, but generally this is a definition in the New Testament that does apply. Beware of the leaven, beware of the thinking, teaching, ideas. Ideas have consequences, Richard Weaver.
It's Richard Weaver, yeah.
Right, so beware of those ideas, because once a little bit of leaven, when you make some bread, you just put the little bit of leaven in, and what happens? It just, on its own, takes over the whole loaf of bread. So once you allow a wrong idea, like we were just talking about with Judy, a classroom. So she's talking about if you got one bad kid comes into the classroom, the idea always, she was telling about her sister teaching, and she thought, well, we can absorb the one bad kid. Well, guess what? The one bad kid flipped the whole class to bad. Okay, so you hear the phrase, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. So you put in a little leaven. It's potential to flip the whole thing.
Well, the question is, what is the basis, or what are the bases of American statutes and decisions and such like that? And that has really been a very long but hidden discussion throughout American history. And that has not really, I think, come into high relief until since World War II. And that's what my book talks about, really, is that whole discussion between American theologians, Catholic theologians primarily, about what are you supposed to base the rules of society on. Now, some societies are based on ideologies, like the Soviet Union was. Some societies were based strictly on the natural law, the natural order, and that's very clearly defined. You want to preserve people, preserve life. You want to worship God in a public and a social way. You want to create an actual culture for the people to live in. You got to protect people. Those are some of the basic rules under the natural law. But what came out of this discussion, and was highlighted more by the discussion, because the popes had really laid it out, was that every society has to follow the divine positive law under Catholic theology. I think the best pope to lay it out.
And did they say why they had to follow it? Just
Because-
because it was right, or because it also has...
Well, because Pope Pius XI in Quas Primas in 1925, paragraphs 15 through 17, he explained that Jesus Christ is the king of the universe, not just, some theoretical, it's all out there type thing. He is the king of every society. And the Pope, Pius XI, even said that, whether it's a Christian society or an atheist society or a Jewish society or an Islamic society. He said, it doesn't matter. He's the king, and he has the power, and you're supposed to honor him and recognize him as part of the social duty of people. My personal view, and I'm doing research on this and writing on it, is that the requirement to follow the divine positive law is a matter of dogma. That's the position I'm advancing with some
The
discussions
requirement
I'm having.
of a nation to follow the divine...
To define is a dogma.
Right, because
I'm saying it's a
even reading
dogma.
the Southerners before the Civil War, it was just a given that America couldn't pass a law if it contravened the Ten Commandments, or if it contravened a clear divine positive law. You just really couldn't do it. And nobody would want to admit that that's what they were doing.
Well, I think that people always understood that you got to have a higher order of things in your laws governing it. You got to obey, God. They always understood that, because for centuries, that's what was taught by the church. That started to break apart after the Protestant so-called Reformation in the 1500s, and then the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment further, broke away reason and faith, and put reason all by itself, and said man can handle it all by himself. And Pius IX in 1846 in Quanta Cura said, if you do that, and he's really repeating what Christ said, if you do that, then you're going to really just simply serve wealth. That's what you're going to do. You're going to serve the wealthy. You're going to serve the accumulation of wealth. You're going to not serve God, and you're going to have all sorts of problems as a result of that. And that's a theme that's been consistently repeated. So the question is, what do we base our laws on? What is the ideology or the theology that the laws are based on? And I'd like to read something from the Catechism. And I got to tell you a little story. I'm on Facebook, and I read what people post. I'm not very good sometimes at posting myself or responding, but I do read Facebook. And this one fellow wrote, he said, I ignore, he said, I'm a Catholic, I ignore the Catechism, and I ignore Vatican II. And somebody said, why do you do that? And he said, well, because the way it's written, it's so ambiguous. And so many people are saying so many different things about what it all means. And he said, if you really want to know what the faith is, read stuff from before 1962. And, I couldn't disagree with the guy. Because really, if you look at so many documents from Vatican II and the Catechism, they're not well written, and you almost have to spend an inordinate amount of time studying them. You almost have to be a theologian to understand it, because there's a lot of hidden meanings. In a way, I think that you can make a case that the way the church has spoken since Vatican II is Americanist. Because Americanism says, essentially, America teaches the church. We got it right with the system of social organization, with liberty, which then, is part of liberalism, capital L. We got it right, so you guys need to do what we do. And that is come up with a means, by which you can all live together. You don't need the formal structures of the church. It's more decentralized. Other aspects of Americanism, and this came out from Leo XIII in 1899, January 22nd, Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, January 22nd, 1899. He said, some of the specifics of this doctrine that we're seeing are that you got to downplay certain aspects of the religion, or you got to put it in a way that isn't so offensive.
Now, is this similar to, I've been kicked out of several places, just here, restaurants here in town, because we're just sitting there talking,
right?
Like this, maybe.
Yeah.
But somebody was fearful that somebody in the room could be offended. Okay.
Right.
So in other words, it seems like they wrote that catechism or the writings of Vatican II. They didn't want to offend anybody.
I think that there is a very strong dynamic there. I think there's a good argument to say Americanism has changed the church, and that's what my book talks about, how it wasn't just the CIA that affected the church, though they had a big role to play with the Prodeo University and some other things. And Prodeo University sent kids to Latin America mostly who believed that the American system of social organization, the founding, was the ideal. Whereas the Catholic ideal is the Catholic confessional state. Everybody follows a divine positive law. The laws are based on the divine positive law. So, yeah, you use reason, but you also use the divine positive law. So you say, well, let's see. So we got Roe versus Wade. This lady's arguing, well, we're a Catholic confessional state. No, you can't have abortion. It's not in the Constitution because we're based on the divine positive law. That limits what we do here. In a governmental sense. But also, too, when a society is based on the divine positive law of Christ, which is the Catholic faith, what you do is you establish the Catholic Church. Well, what that does is that also affects the private, the personal relationships between people. It gives real power to a system of beliefs to regulate the way people operate and work in day-to-day life. And this is something that the Rockefellers and Murray and Luce and all these guys talked about. They said, if we go with this Catholic confessional state, there's going to be a lot of pressure, in society. So, on people. So this is very interesting because it goes into the next point. And this is actually from section 2244. And the Catechism says, and this is actually not badly written, I'll tell you where I have a problem, but every institution is inspired, at least implicitly, by a vision of man and his destiny, from which it derives the point of reference for its judgment, its hierarchy of values, its line of conduct. I mean, that's a very good statement. Most societies have formed their institutions in the recognition of a certain preeminence of man over things. Only the divinely revealed religion, the Catholic Church, Catholic religion, has clearly recognized man's origin and destiny in God, the Creator, and the Redeemer. Okay, man's origin and destiny. That means that's where you're going, so that means you got to have society based on virtue. The Church invites political authorities, and this is invites, no, yeah, okay, I guess, you kind of invite everybody, like, I'm the policeman here, and I'm inviting you to stop committing that crime. Okay. The Church invites political authorities to measure their judgments and decisions against the inspired truth about God and man. The Church tells everybody that's what you got to do, So this is what's very interesting because it relates to some of the current topics that are going on. Society is not recognizing this vision or rejecting it in the name of their independence from God. And that's clearly an attack on liberalism, capital L. That's clearly an attack on communism and on all these ideologies. Or rejecting it in the name of their independence from God, are brought to seek their criteria and goal in themselves or to borrow them from some ideology. Since they do not admit that one can defend an objective criterion of good and evil, they arrogate to themselves an explicit or implicit totalitarian power over man and his destiny, as history shows. And so, what's going on right now in Canada?
That's Trudeau.
That's
And
what the truckers
and he
are
can't
saying.
camouflage it. He's caught, and more the people are seeing him in light of what's probably more true, that he is acting out of that I'm the authority. But of course he's not. He's connected to a lot of wealthy people.
Well, I think that's what happens in liberal societies ultimately, like the ones that we live in. If you divorce yourself from this vision that the church talks about, you're going to end up like Christ said, like Pius IX said, serving wealth. And so I think that we're seeing it now. We are seeing the powerful private interests, which I discuss in my book. We're seeing the powerful private interests exercising their power in the society. We're seeing it, with the Joe Rogan situation, right? I mean, the government isn't shutting him down. And so in that sense, the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press, works pretty good. I mean, the government's not shutting him down.
Amy Coney Barrett is going to totally support his freedom there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the government, and that, yeah, if he's speaking the truth, that's really great. So, but what you're having is that you're having the private interests shut him down, okay? You had the private interests, go out there and shut down all these YouTube channels. Dr. Malone and all these other people who are trying to get the truth out as they know it, as they understand it, as others believe. And there is an enormous amount of anecdotal and empirical evidence of problems with this new mRNA.
I just did a show with Gus, and his was on, why we need the First Amendment. And you're going to try to emphasize, there's a problem with the First Amendment.
I think the problem is this. Regardless of why the First Amendment was designed, and it was clearly of great interest to the founders to have the First Amendment put in with, freedom of speech, freedom of press, free exercise of religion, disestablishment of any religion or church, and then, freedom to petition the government peaceably. There was a real special emphasis to put that in there. I think, my theory is that a lot of that goes back to Tom Paine and the philosophy that he crystallized in Common Sense. There were also very practical aspects to the First Amendment.
Yeah, they couldn't get the Constitution agreed upon.
They couldn't get a Constitution agreed upon. They also couldn't fight the British successfully if they didn't have that. So the founders understood that, we need religious liberty and all that brings out, and, everything, we're complaining about the government crushing us. We got to stand up for that. The founders understood that, and they said, we got to have free speech and religious liberty and all this stuff. And religious liberty is what I mostly focus on. We got to have these things to get everybody on board. That's what Bernard Bailyn says, and I think he was right.
Right. They were going, how can we get the people on board? They weren't drawing this off a really ideal Lockean theory. This was a practical draw.
It was a practical draw, but they also had the Lockean theory to back them up. Now, you can't say that things happen all because of one reason. There's usually a confluence of reasons that come together, okay, to make things happen. So it was a smart idea to put the First Amendment in its place. It brought everybody together to fight the British, and what it also did is it got the little guys to come in and fight the British, because we can protest, we can say what we want to say. And also what it did, and I've said this before, and as I believe time has borne this out, it also serves to check the government, to weaken the government. It serves to check the church, weaken the church. And it also checks to also control, to a degree, the populace, okay? It allows them to do certain things.
But when you say check, that sounds nice, but when you say weaken, that sounds negative.
You're way ahead of me on so many things, and you're listening carefully to what I say, and I really appreciate that. But it does. It weakens the government. It weakens the church, and it actually weakens the power of the mob. Because I postulate that ultimately private powerful interests are ultimately worried about those three things. They're worried about a strong government. They're worried about a strong independent Catholic
As far
Church.
as their interests are concerned.
Right, because that can limit their ability to do things. This is what I found in my research. This has been more pronounced. What I'm telling you about has been more pronounced really since the end of World War II, where I think the First Amendment has been used definitely more aggressively by the powerful private interests to get God, away from the people, out of the public sphere. That's Everson, that's Engel versus Vitale, that's Lemon versus Kurtzman.
Well, you know all about my case,
Right, and that's another case. That to get this religion from checking their power, because you really had in World War II you had, and with the Cold War you had an upsurge in religiosity, if that's what you want to say. You also had a lot of Catholics coming into being. The baby boom was mostly Catholic, and so this was a very real concern. And what the powerful private interests from 1945 on did is they wanted to take this First Amendment and radicalize it around the world, because they didn't want strong governments. They were trying to penetrate, and I discuss it in there in these conferences that were officially unofficial, with government and labor and intel and all that, and banks. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to go into these countries, ostensibly to fight the Soviet Union, and create an environment that was favorable to Western capital and Western industry and Western ideas. So you do that first with the Constitution. You do that with liberty, with the American experiment being a success. And America was the big winner.
Well, you're going into it because we had just pure motives, and we saw that Hitler was really evil, and we went in there just to remove the evil from the world, so the world could just proceed in peace. And that was our message.
Well, maybe that was the message, but if you take a look at what Roosevelt, FDR, said on January 6, 1941, and then February 7th, wow, that's tomorrow, February 17th.
January 6, 1941.
Yep, State of the Union address. And then February 17th, 1941, Henry Luce wrote his American Century article, and he said, you know what, and it's in the book, basically, we got to go to war because we got to make the world safe for American commerce. I mean, he basically said that. I'm paraphrasing, I'm simplifying it, but that's what he says. He says, what do you want? I mean, we run the sea lanes. We got to strengthen that. Our commerce benefits the world. And commerce was a very powerful dynamic in the 1760s. A guy by the name of Thomas Paine was a Brit. And he wrote something, he wrote a couple of things, but the one that was of most interest to me was the memorial concerning the colonies. And it's a real long, they put real long titles in those things. But anyway, he wrote it around 1764. And he said, what we have is a very strong dynamic here in the New World. It is a commercial dynamic. And he was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And he was also a governor for a very short time of South Carolina and New Jersey.
Wow, so
he kind of knew what was happening.
Well, his ideas are getting out there.
He wrote a couple of pamphlets, a couple of books, saying, America is going to be the new center of commerce. I mean, he's writing this in 1764 because he saw the potential, and so did the American founders. Undoubtedly, they saw that too. They saw the potential too. So you have a very strong commercial dynamic that was going on. That was borne out by the efforts of Alexander Hamilton, and I thank Charles Beard for this understanding.
But just to clarify a definition for me, commerce boils down and touches on the love of money. Okay.
Commerce deals with money, but it involves manufacturing.
But there's temptation. The book of Sirach says between buying and selling is so much sin, only a man who greatly fears the God is going to keep his house from falling.
Well, commerce involves money, and it also involves manufacturing and agriculture and trade.
And then success is who's getting the most.
That's how a lot of success is valued in our society. Mm-hmm. And a large reason for that is because you don't have, the divine positive law or a common set of religious beliefs informing
as that which we're trying to strive for. In other words, success isn't just automatically given to those who are living according to the divine positive law.
The Catechism tells us, and Catholic doctrine has always been, the purpose of society is to build virtue. because as I read to you, there is a beginning and an end of man. Man has a purpose. Society and the governing authorities have got to make sure that we achieve that, that we reach that,
this
that
push
we
for
get there.
This
Okay?
push for
That's what we're
commerce
supposed
is
to do.
competing with that.
That's what the Catholic religion says. So what you had with Alexander Hamilton was the creation of the system, the government system. And Kevin Phillips, remember him? He wrote The Politics of Rich and Poor and the Coming Republican Majority. He also wrote a book called Wealth and Democracy, which came out in 2002. He's an old man now. Nobody talks about him. But he said the same thing, I think that I'm saying, is that what you created, what Hamilton and others created in the Constitution, was a structure that allowed for effective economic growth. It allowed for capitalism, it allowed for commerce, and it allowed for the institutions by which you could raise capital, create things, and become that commercial center of the world. Charles Beard helped me with that. He's from Indiana. Great people come from Indiana, let's face it.
Especially around Lafayette.
Yeah, that's what I hear. So that is a dynamic here, which I know we can't go into all the specifics. But what Kevin Phillips also said is that you had social Darwinism develop in the 1800s with Herbert Spencer. And that was this idea that survival of the fittest in the economic and social sense. So this idea, your success is determined by how much money you make, is the big deal. Now, what the wealthy families did, as Phillips recounts, what the wealthy families did, and what really great fortunes were made doing, is working with the government, okay? And working with the government-established institutions. And he talks about a number of different ways, taxation, stipends, subsidies, all sorts of things, even, opening commerce through war, securing raw resources through war. He talks about how the powerful private interests actually took control of the states in the latter half of the 1800s, got control of the legislature, to control the Senate, to make the selections of the Supreme Court justices, so that they could basically control the law even. He even goes so far as making that claim. So what you have here is a very strong dynamic that of creating this commercial center, along with this idea of everybody's going to work together to fight off the British. But what you've had since 1945 is this incredible weaponization of the First Amendment, and it prompted Sean Spicer on Thanksgiving Day in 2020 to say, when asked, people were saying, how come Antifa and BLM burned down our cities? How can George Soros do this? Why aren't our leaders doing anything? He said, well, it's the First Amendment. I mean, that was his answer, the First Amendment. And it has been weaponized. The First Amendment says under Miller and Cohen, under those decisions, that freedom of expression is allowed. Well, that's a far cry from freedom of speech.
But they also weaponize the attorneys, the lawyers, because when I got fired for just bringing a Bible in the classroom, which should have been completely in conformity with the Indiana Constitution, I couldn't find an attorney, okay? But they're not having a problem getting attorneys for the Black Lives Matter people. I mean, they're going to Yale and they're getting all kinds of attorneys.
Well, but what does that show? That shows the support of that movement, okay? That shows that the support has been signaled by the powerful private interests. I mean, in June of 2020, if you remember correctly, you had all the Mark Cuban, I can't think of the name of the guy from Google, Bloomberg, all these guys came out and they said, we support this movement, it's all about racial justice. So everybody now knows which way the wind is blowing. You just instinctively pick that up in this society if you're listening. And you kind of know what is approved by the successful people.
Yeah, if you want to be successful in the commercial realm, this is what you listen to.
Well, there's leaders in every society. And in our society, we have civil authorities who are supposed to lead and do what is Well, that's the idea. Yeah, this is the idea we talked about. You know, what are they supposed to do when you elect your leaders? Are they supposed to do the will of the people? Well, how do you measure the will of the people? Can you give them all the facts to know what it is different times of the day? Or are they supposed to do what's right? They're supposed to be wise men and act.
If you had a
what's right.
Catholic confessional state, my position is, if you fully acknowledge Jesus Christ in the Constitution, you got your foot in the door, okay. But if you did have the Catholic confessional state, then the politicians are going to have to be skilled in operating under it. So you had Christian politics. Okay, now you have political science. I majored in political science, but if you go back, you would major in Christian politics. In other words, you studied how you should govern in conformity with the divine positive law.
Well, isn't this what the prophets said in the Old Testament to the people of Israel and the rulers of Israel? Nehemiah and Amos and Jeremiah and all these guys said, you know, you're shortchanging the people with money, with wheat. You're not doing the things you're supposed to do. You're acting immorally. And then what did Jesus Christ say at the Sermon on the Mount? He said, I'm not coming to destroy the prophets and the law. I'm coming to fulfill it.
And he really attacked the whole commercial. In other words, he said, don't be like the pagans who are, what am I going to eat? What am I going to drink? And so you're so obsessed about getting your earthly needs met. He said, don't worry about that. My Heavenly Father, He takes care of as far as clothes, the lilies of the field, as far as the sparrows, He takes care of them. I'm going to take more care of you. Don't make that your obsession.
So what this whole thing with COVID-19 has done, I think, is to give everybody a black eye, just about everybody a black eye. It's a lose-lose for about everybody. I think the medical community has lost a lot of credibility. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is in conversations with day-to-day people. The mainstream media has certainly lost a lot of credibility. You got, political leaders really being disregarded or pretty virulently attacked. You got parts of the population being demonized. So you got all the systems, all the structures are really, I think, are really in a lose-lose situation because of this COVID-19 stuff. And you have to look at what was the basis of society. If society was going to follow the natural law, which I don't think it has in America since 1947, despite what everyone says, I think there's been an attempt by the people to want to follow the natural law. That's why you see the pro-life movement. That's why you see the gun rights movement. That's why you see, traditional values people saying, we got to have some values. We got to bring decency back to the arts or whatever. I think there's been this effort to do that, but it's been resisted.
But what about the law?
By the powerful private
interests?
How
about Notre Dame Law School? I mean, and Charlie Rice, it's all for the natural law, but they can't get this off the ground.
I think that may have been an idea, but that is a very bare minimum. But I don't think it can hold the line. I don't think history has shown in this country in the last 70 years that it's been able to hold the line. And so that's why you have what you have going on now. And what's really troubling to me is when you pick up Fortune magazine on February 4th of this year, there's an article by Ray Dalio, very wealthy, very rich hedge fund guy. He's one of the powerful private interests, and he's saying there will be a civil war after the next election. I mean, that's the headline.
Then after which next election?
November 2024, next presidential election.
After that one.
And then he's talking to David Rubenstein, who, another big guy. I like listening to David Rubenstein. I think he has some great guests on. I think he's a very, very interesting fella to listen to. And he's very humorous. But he's having, Dalio's telling him this is realistic to think about this. It's realistic. And you have certain groups of the population being demonized as anti-democratic, which is what happened with the truckers when Trudeau said that about the truckers. You're being anti-democratic.
Which is like Hillary saying the Trump followers are deplorables. Because they're going to use what Trudeau say and throw it back on them.
Right, and this kind of language is really dangerous and it's bad. But it's language that is, in my view, authorized by these powerful private interests. And it's very troubling to me. And I think that without a common set of beliefs, definitely without the common Catholic faith and the Catholic confessional state. We've ended up here at a tough spot with COVID-19.
Well, you have said that America was a first, the American experiment, a nation had never been formed based on how we did it. And the only thing I see is that the Constitution does not acknowledge God, although the states do, okay, but became irrelevant that the states did after the Civil War, okay, so that the federal Constitution then now tells the states what they can and can't do as far as the First Amendment. So if the state wants to have a teacher even have a Bible in the classroom, the federal government can say, no, you can't have the Ten Commandments on the wall. Well, that would be similar with a teacher bringing a Bible in just to read to himself, because it's putting pressure on these kids to think that they have to like go by the Bible or something, you know. So you said this was
well
no
when
nation
you're a teacher and you're looking at a Bible, you're a leader. When you stand in front of a classroom, you're a leader.
Yeah, and you're just reading it to yourself. But then any book you read, how do they discern, well, you can't have the Bible, well, what could I have then? Okay? I'm just saying they get lost then. Okay, then, well, you're neutral. Well, you're not neutral as far as me having the Bible.
A secular state, I submit, can never be neutral to religion. And that's the thought of other people too many to name. I don't think you can have a secular state that is absolutely neutral to religion.
Well, so in other words, we're looking at the flaws of the experiment, because the flaws of the experiment are the assumption that you could be or something. Is that one of the presuppositions, that they could be?
I'm not sure I follow your question. I think that...
well, you just said it's impossible they could be neutral. Well, isn't there this image that they are trying to be neutral?
I think there was an idea at one point. I see. At one point, I think there was an idea that, you know, we're not going to pick any denomination over any others.
Then what is your position? Is like, okay, well, then what do you stand for?
Well, de Tocqueville said what you had all the religions basically supporting this thing because the government was not beating up on the religions, wasn't showing favoritism to the religions. But then what happens after a while, the government doesn't show any favoritism to any religions and becomes hostile. And that's the thinking of a lot of people, and that's why you have a lot of lawsuits over religious liberty matters today, especially dealing with things like contraception and abortion and other things like that.
Well, you have a total confusion, because on one hand we want to believe we're one of the best, greatest Christian nations there has ever been. Look at all the missionaries, okay? But then on the other hand, the Constitution does not acknowledge God. Therefore, a teacher can't even bring a Bible into the classroom just to read to themselves. So in other words, God is not acknowledged, and that carries through with the government. And then when you have half the people leaning on the government by welfare or working for them in some direct or indirect way, the government can kind of impose their atheism upon them.
There's some form of belief system, just like I read that piece from the Catechism, that starts to come in and fill the void of religion. Something fills that void.
And you're saying that this notion of radical equality, or how would you describe what has filled the void?
De Tocqueville always talked about radical equality and radical democracy, and he says the two were always fighting things out to the extreme. So what has filled the void now? A lot of people say it's secular humanism.
Right, which the Supreme Court has almost acknowledged as a type of religion itself.
Yeah, they have.
So in the meantime, if you send your child into, well, it's been until recently 90% of the children have gone to a public school, or it's a high figure. So they're in there from age 6 till 18. What's that doing to their religious faith, being in there that long?
Well, it probably hurts their faith quite a bit. So that's why you have to get educated at home in your faith if you're religious, and if you're Catholic, you definitely got to learn it probably at home or some religious training. But you know what you deal with is you're dealing with this situation where religion is, and probably for good reason, because a lot of people see a lot of nuts talking about religion. They see a lot of demagogues using religion. They don't follow the requirement of truth. And so you have a lot of confusion out there, a lot of bad experiences with religion. And the leadership needs to lead. The church leadership needs to lead, and lead as it has over centuries. And that is the mandate set to Catholics, at least, by the popes, and that is to Catholicize the fatherland and to make it Catholic, to bring Catholic ideas and views as forming the basis of society and governing what happens. And one of those very important views is contained in Inter Mirifica, which we've talked about before, which is the means of the use of social communications, whereby the government is supposed to limit some of the speech, some of the things that are said, for the purposes of genuine culture, for truth, and for what's beneficial, basically to limit the powerful private interests.
But the government has kind of gone neutral in this case here, and then YouTube, if you want to try to get this out to the public.
Well, that's why people have called for YouTube and Facebook and these other things to be turned into like shopping malls. There were a bunch of cases that said, well, if it's open to the public, then it's got to be considered like either a public utility or a publicly operated area, and so certain rules in the First Amendment and statutes have got to apply. That's what some people have said. Is that going that way?
The oligarchs are not allowing that to happen.
I don't think the plutocrats want that to happen. They want to control the language, and so what you have, and the case, unfortunately, that I think that Kevin Phillips made, not unfortunately, but I'm glad he did, is that this idea of plutocracy, where things are run for the benefit of the few, the plutocrats are using the laws and the system to their benefit. In the views of many people, that is starting to appear like tyranny, and that is problematic.
Right, and we're seeing that happen. Dave, we're done here now, but I think you explained a lot of things there that are going to be helpful to some people.
It's always a good discussion. We didn't talk about all the other things. Joe Donnelly, Senator Donnelly, was just appointed, just sworn in yesterday as the ambassador to go to the Vatican.
That's another whole show, but we got to wrap it up.
That's another whole show, but congratulations to him and his family.
Okay. This is Peter Helland, David Wemhoff on the show Israel.